Are we ready? Yeah. Okay. Great. So yeah, I think the session is around system strengthening, and I think something that I sort of spoke about, and some people who were in some of the roundtables that I was in yesterday will heard me say, is that a lot of times when we're talking about scale, systems, education, it's very focused on the school, on the government, and on those sort of centralised structures. And what tends to get lost is the community, the parents, and the life world within which the children are living in a day-to-day. We were having some discussions the other day and with some colleagues, and I think we're looking at values-based education in the coast of Kenya, and I think what's coming out is that children navigate non-formal, informal and formal education during their socialisation processes a lot, and that at times there can be this disconnect between what's going on in the formal and what's going on in the non-formal. And for a long time, schools have been seen as a beacon to try and create progressive change within communities in remote rural locations, etc., etc. But without really thinking about how that connects to the everyday life world of the children. And this is I think this is a global phenomenon. I was working in a school in North London when I was a teacher in South Camden, and I could tell that the kids were living in a schizophrenic world. They came to school and they had one kind of thinking, and they went home and they had a very different kind of thinking. And they found it very difficult to navigate those two different worlds. And so really, I think something that I think we need to think about as we talk about scale, as we talk about systems. You know, during the 1980s and 90s in the UK, we went through this phase of, you know, the way in which you could engage with your social service provider, be it education, be it health or whatever, was not to engage in productive change, but to withdraw your custom, because you were pretty much seen in the neoliberal sense as a customer of a social service. So no longer could you actually be involved in productive change, you actually just withdrew that custom, so you withdrew your child from that school. And that has lent itself to the way in which we are now operating within a lot of contexts today. We talk about community participation, we talk about these things, but it has become very instrumentalized. And I think we are starting to change that. But the idea that we're pushed towards, we must scale things, and the idea that a document at the systems level, at a government level, suddenly means that you can scale it, is pushing a lot of ideas and thinking to sort of go into that systems world thinking, and the life world of children and of the communities is being left behind. And you know, I think some of the evidence that's come out is that alternative ways of thinking have not just been marginalised, they've been vilified. And so children coming from these alternative backgrounds are actually finding it very, very difficult to fit into the norm of the system when their everyday way of being in their homes is being vilified. And I think we are starting to draw back towards understanding. But the idea that you can deliver a quality of education without incorporating the life worlds and relevance of the community is very, very odd for me. And I just want a few things, as we've been listening to people in the plenary sessions, I've just been writing some things down that sort of resonate with this point. You've got Dr. Johnson on the first day saying, you know, what is education without the beating heart of the community? You've got Mike yesterday from the Global Teacher Award saying learning needs meaning. How do you create meaning if it's disconnected from your everyday way of knowing? And then you had it was Mike again actually who said narratives from the classroom need to be impacting policy. And okay, that's still within the system, but the classroom is located within its community. The narratives of the community, narratives of the classroom, need to start influencing and pushing up into policy recommendations rather than the policy being driven down through the system. And we all have this idealism that, you know, grassroots and everything coming up and all the rest of it. But there are ways that we can amplify what it means to be quality education in the classroom, which is relevant to the everyday life worlds of the children. So really, I think underlying this is, as we look at this, and sort of the question that really I want to dig into over the next sort of 10 years or so, during 2030, as this is, as you said, what we're here to discuss, is as we look at scale, as we look at system strengthening, as we look at these very important issues, and not to undermine the importance of having system structures and frameworks and all the rest of it, but as we look at these, let's not completely disconnect it and marginalise the very, very diverse communities that are having to operate within these systems. You know, no country is a flat surface. The communities are very different. Their needs are very different. And we need to recognise that there is this diversity, embrace this diversity, and if we do actually want to achieve quality education, the system needs to embrace that diversity and allow flexibility within its national borders to enable children to access a quality of education that is relevant to their own living. So that's really the sort of the question: how do we support systems to embrace diversity? How do we engage systems to be reactive, reflective, and flexible? You know, we heard twice today government saying that they are nimble and that they're being reactive and all the rest of it. That's great. What does that actually mean in reality? How do we sort of implement that? So that's the basic sort of gist of what I wrote about. So yeah, and pass on.
Fantastic.
Great.
All right, we can jump right into our second presentation. So over to you, Bernadette. Or is it Oksana or Bernadette?
Yeah.
It's Oksana.
Oksana, yeah.
Glad you know the order better than I
yeah.
do.
Well, dear colleagues, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, because this is truly an international and wonderful chance to meet people from different countries of the world and to ask many questions, many hard questions, and perhaps to find some answers, taking into account global uncertainties and challenges that we face during a very long period of time already. So the paper I will be presenting, and the title of the paper I will be presenting sounds as Inclusive Cities: Lifelong Learning for Sustainable Development, Functional Transformation and Social Cohesion in Urban Slums. So this paper was written by 4 people, and I'm one of the co-authors. 2 of them, that is David Johnson and Rebecca Epp from Oxford University, and one of our colleagues, Professor Vadim Strelkovsky, is from Cambridge University. Actually, in this company, I am a theoretician, but not a practitioner, because, however, I'm speaking about urban slums, and these are in different parts of the world. I was doing this theoretical research, and perhaps in the future I will have a chance to, to get some experience in these countries and cities I'm talking about. And at the same time, I think that what is very important now is that I will be looking at the things I'm talking about from a meta position, because I had no field work actually participating, and at the same time there are no urban slums in the country of my origin, and I come from Russia. Nevertheless, this topic was quite interesting for me to study. The issues I wish to concentrate on are of global character, and I think that two concepts are very, very important to focus on. The first one is the concept of a learning city or inclusive city, which is getting more and more popularity today. And however, this concept was worked for many years on, for example, by the colleagues from Glasgow University. There are two organizations working there, two networks like Pascal and Cradle, who were developing this concept extensively from 2000. And the group of Professor Malman, they have written a lot about that. At the same time, this concept is widely promoted right now by UNESCO, and starting from Beijing Declaration on Building Learning Cities from 2013, and now UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, which is situated in Hamburg, is working hard on making this network of learning cities growing more and more. Right now, they have 205 cities. I've consulted their website yesterday, and already this network has grown to up to 205 cities. So they have issued their document, Global Network of Learning Cities Guiding Document, which we may consult, and it will give us a broader sense of what learning cities are. But anyway, this is their aim, where most of the cities, most of contemporary cities could go, because this is a way of life which will give us a chance to live together and learn to live together in the age of uncertainty, in the age of transformations, and the global risks we face today. And the second issue I will be facing is lifelong learning and its understanding in relation to the marginalized groups of the city dwellers. Cities today are very problematic, I would say, and they are problematic in different ways. I mean here spheres like social, economic, environmental, and besides that we see social stratification which exists in many areas. People are very complex and they are very different. So the main question again comes to the following. Do we want to live in sustainable cities? And if yes, what should we do for that? And how in deeply divided cities we might learn to live together? And this concept of UNESCO learning to live together is again very, very acute. And I would add here the question of how education may help in that. A learning city provides lifelong learning for all. And lifelong learning is the foundation of cities' sustainable development. I would even say that for UNESCO, the city is central for sustainable and inclusive development, and lifelong learning is the lifeblood of the city. Let me quote UNESCO's definition of lifelong learning. It is less about the teaching or training of certain things or specific skills, much more a way of describing a process of empowerment and mechanisms through which local communities are exposed to varied learning opportunities that helps to prepare them for anticipating the unknown and tackling the political and social uncertainties of tomorrow. In a word, It is that penetrates them for sustainable futures. The questions that guided our study are best expressed into propositions. The first one is, the social inequality and even structural features offer cities and vulnerable city dwellers the most socially significant opportunities for lifelong learning. And the second one, that the reduction of structural inequalities and the promotion of social cohesion, where citizens live together in peace and with respect to human dignity, is enabled through community-led social action and joint action between slum dwellers and city authorities. To test these propositions, we examined 3 case studies, and where we took the cities where we found bright examples of urban slums, and these cities were contrasting. I am talking about Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Mumbai in India, and Nairobi in Kenya. However, I will stress my attention only on Rio de Janeiro and the experience of how it seems to us of becoming a learning city. From the methodological viewpoint, the study was a parallel demonstration of theory. That is, the method involved an attempt to validate a set of propositions through juxtaposition, and we used a number of case studies in order to find similarities so as to illustrate that a given theory has common applicability. Mostly it was a library-based research, and we researched educational activities in urban slums. Here appears to be at least 3 distinct yet interrelated social curriculum areas around which slum dwellers learn. So the first and probably the most frequently referred to in the literature is access to basic services, including water and sanitation and improvement of the physical environment. The second one, learning area. In social discord and insecurity brought about through drug trafficking, prostitution, and extortion, often tightly coordinated through rival criminal gangs. And the third area of engagement is social welfare. This includes educational and health well-being and the development of small business enterprises that make the slum viable. Our key argument is that it is around these 3 major social life worlds that cities learn or not through social engagement, dialogue, problem solving, and experimentations. Those that do successfully establish at least a basis for social cohesion. As I'm very short of time, I would like to say that in Rio de Janeiro there is according to the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, there is a Rio favela which equals around 1 million people. And of course, this favela faces a lot of problems, starting from gangs, gangsters, and so on and so forth. And violence is a very big problem there. But educationalists try to answer these challenges. And one of the good examples is policy pass fan units, for example. Then a very interesting project, Providence Project, which provides a suite of educational services such as tutoring, theater and vocational training, as well as basic care and psychological assistance. Also, there should be mentioned Mellow Project, which was devoted to teaching street children. And I should say that Rio de Janeiro has some way to go to becoming an inclusive learning city. But there is a strong, and they have the strong basis for it. And I think that, again, I should stress that the center for it, the central point for it, is their community and collective engagement in learning about and learning to do. And because all the changes start from the person, of course, but in the case of urban slums, this is the community that drives the change and lets it go further and further. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Over to you, Bernadette.
That was fast. Okay, so what I'm going to just talk about is a little bit education in the Soviet times, what happened post-Soviet Union, and then the project that I'm working on to improve the quality of the learning outcomes in schools and how what we are trying to do within education systems to strengthen those systems rather than out of the system, as many of the projects that do come in tend to work. In Soviet times, education, 70 years that the Soviets were in Central Asia. What happened to my computer? Suddenly, of course, that happens, it blacks out on you when you need it. They made really phenomenal progress in education. You had practically a movement from 1% educated to 100% adult literacy. You had a very well-developed infrastructure for education provision and administration. There was relative equality of access. There is some evidence that it wasn't equal, but relatively. Highly qualified teachers, many higher education institutions, high education achievement, and high graduation rates. There were some issues with the system. It was highly centralized. Everything of education was planned, financed, and implemented by Moscow. And education was used to legitimize the Soviet state and the Communist Party. 3 elements. I'm having someone Russian here sitting next to me while I'm talking about these things. And 3 elements the literature suggests influence very much the content and processes of the education system. One was that the content was highly specialized due to the planned economy. 2, there was indoctrination into the state ideology. And 3, Russian language and literature was seen as a way of building a common culture and erasing difference so that everyone would see themselves as a Soviet man or Soviet woman rather than within their ethnic groups. And in schools and classrooms, the teaching of facts and rote learning prevailed throughout the system. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and these countries became independent, most of them faced 3 crises. One of them, the biggest crisis, was the economic crisis because the financial resources that came from Moscow suddenly stopped, and so all the countries had to adopt austerity measures. Spending on education decreased rapidly. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan, GDP on education fell from 6.8% in 1990 to 2.9% of what was then a much smaller GDP in 1994. And austerity had many negative effects on the education infrastructure, deteriorated. Qualified teachers left the system because salaries became very low, and not only that, sometimes salaries were not paid for months on time because there were not money there. So most of the qualified teachers left the system. Schools started having multiple shifts. There were lack of teaching resources. Still today there are some of these issues. Enrollment and participation rates, which went nearly 100%, started to decline rapidly. And there was a general lack of quality. You don't have qualified teachers, no resources, etc. A second one was quickly, as everyone tries to explain to governments, decentralize. So another issue was decentralization. But actually, governments centralized control. They developed their ministries of education and kept all the control. But they decentralized it and said, okay, you manage education and you fund education yourself, right, to the regional governments. And what happened with that was the regional governments didn't have the money. Some regions had more money, some regions had less money, so there was inequality there. And those regions that didn't have money, there was a negative effects, run down on schools closed. Schools started trying to find their own resources. You had discouraged teachers, low attendance, and increased corruption because as schools had to try and find their own resources, there was opportunity for more corruption there. There were structural and economic anomalies. One of the main thing was structure. There was no structure left there, right? Because the whole structure was planning, management, everything. done in Moscow, so they had to really rebuild a whole education system. And with the Soviet system, centralized budget making, budget allocations at the center, and devolution of financial responsibility for the center to the regions, you had all these cuts. So what happened is the central budget said, well, we're giving it to you to decentralize, so we'll cut our budget for education. And what actually happened was the regions didn't have it, so they had to go back to the federal government for the budgets. And so today you still have the governments, the federal governments, the state governments having to support the regions for education because the regions don't have the money to provide education. And one of the things that also happened was that schools had to raise their own funds, and governments put great pressure on schools to become more efficient, to do more with less. In the light of their new realities, both national and global realities, the education system had to reform very quickly to meet both the socio-economic needs of them and their future aspirations. For example, Kazakhstan's future aspiration is by 2050 to become one of the top 30 among the top 30 global countries in the world. So you can see the aspirations and the needs. And so they had to put in a new system, enact new laws, set up new institutions, revise the curriculum. That was one of the first things that happened. Take out the Soviet ideology, put in national culture and customs and traditions, national language, etc. That started happening very quickly. And what you see is the systems going through these sort of cycles of reform. So what I've looked at is actually 3 cycles of curriculum reform happening, and now all of them have competency-based curriculums. And one of the biggest issues that they faced was both decline in access and quality. All 3 governments have now managed to preserve. Their main thing was to preserve access. All of them have managed to get that. Tajikistan, a little slightly less than the others, but most of them have managed to preserve access. But one of the main things is the quality, especially for the kind of new employments that are open up, the IT sector, banking, etc., and you don't have people with the skills to get into these sectors. Many development and donor agencies have been in there, and many of the reform policies have not gone as planned. So you've had some that were very good, some that completely failed, and others that have had no impact. So if you look at the Soviet, of these 3 countries, all of them in the first 10 years look more or less the same. What we're beginning to see now is each of them beginning to become a little different. They all sort of took on their own policies. You see a lot of international players in there. Now what we're beginning to see is some regional learning from each other in the regions. So when the university started, the University of Central Asia has been in existence since 2000 with the signing of agreements with the 3 governments with His Highness the Aga Khan. However, we only started the first undergraduate program of the university in 2016. And what the university realized is it didn't have the kind of graduates ready to take an international undergraduate program. And so the university thought, if we are having these problems and have to have a preparatory program for students, why don't we work with secondary schools to try and improve the quality of the learning outcomes there? So the first thing we did was a scoping study to understand the situation, review all the national development strategies, and identify what was really needed to be done there. And by talking to everyone, reading the literature, we decided that we would work to improve the quality of the learning outcomes in grades 7 to 11 in STEM, ICT, and English, and the 21st century competencies. And we have more than the 4 competencies that you find in the literature. We added to them cultural diversity, which we felt was very important. We added to them its citizenship, and we added to it also full in and what we are calling character, in which they are all those kind of social and emotional skills and competencies that students need to add to them. So in addition to creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication, etc. So we have Our motivations for the EIP is what you heard yesterday, the kind of uncertainty, scale and pace of change, etc., but also the kind of things that are happening in the actual classrooms. And what we see happening there is that there is largely the transmission or lecture method, which is the dominant approach. Again, ability to regurgitate facts on tests is very important. The PISA study, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan participated in PISA, and they found that students had the knowledge but not the skills to address issues in the real world. And one of the other things that we have found is that while some of these competencies are embedded in the curriculum, you don't see them in current teaching and learning practices in the classroom. So that's what I'm just going to then quickly, because I see I only have 1 minute left. So the focus of the EIP is largely on teaching and learning in the real classroom. So learning is our focus, and of course learning can't happen without good teachers, so that's our focus. But we recognize, so what we want to do is work within the education system. Most of the projects and all sort of work outside and bring in other partners, etc. What we want to do is work very much within the education. So we want to work with pre-service and in-service teacher institutions. Most of the work has been done currently only in-service, very small, each project for their own to realize their own outcomes has done in service. There has been no pre-service, any development in the pre-service sector, largely because a lot of teachers that do go in, even with money from the government to support them, then don't go into teaching when they graduate 4 years later. So most of the donors feel there's no use spending money there, we'll just do something in service. But we think it's very important to improve in service if we're going to help the system become sustainable and scalable. So that's one of the focuses that we have. The second focus that we have is that of school leaders. We know that schools can't make any improvement without school leaders. So facilitating the professional development of school leaders will be very, very important for us. And what we want to do also here is there is no school leadership training in any of the institutions, pre-service or in-service. So what we want to do is help to develop that within the sector there so that school directors can get the training. And we want to focus on largely instructional leadership of the school principal. How does she or other people down there become school leaders? And in the teaching and learning, in the work with the teachers, we want to do some workshops, but the focus we want to place very much is on in-classroom support and coaching for the teachers. And one of the very good things about the Soviet system is that they have 1 day a week in the school where teachers do not teach in the classroom. They have a planning day, a working day together. And we want to use this time, restructure it, reformulate it, so that teachers can use this time to talk with each other, develop learning activities, formative assessment, etc. Try it out in their classrooms, come back, talk about it, improve it, and then go on. And we realized two other things that are very important. Since we are a university, we feel that research is very important, so that what we do, we want to learn what are the best practices, put them in, see how they work in this context, as well as some of the innovations that we do, we want to look at them. So some of the things we are doing is conducting a situation analysis in all the schools. We're doing a little bit of program and personnel needs analysis of the teacher educational institutions. We're trying to do small case studies of schools that we already feel are doing well, so that we can learn some of the good practices from within the system to be able to take those on more widely. And finally, to be able to scale up and move further, we want to, in 2 or 3 years, identify some of these schools as resource schools that will then work with neighboring schools. Now, we know that much of the literature shows that this has not worked very much, especially when you have too many schools, one school having to work with many schools. So we're looking at how we would be able to make that work a little better. Thank you.
Great, thank you.